Good afternoon. This is Audrey Russo, President and CEO of the Pittsburgh Technology Council. It is the week of Christmas, but the show goes on here. And today we are pretty thrilled to have Paul Mango back with us, and we're going to introduce him appropriately in 1 minute. Want to give a shout out to Huntington Bank, thanking them for all year of being their great partners with us on every experiment that we've ran in terms of telling stories and making sure that we're highlighting all that we need to highlight during this pandemic. And it's hard to believe that it's Christmas, but I also want to give a big shout out to the Jewish Healthcare Foundation. They've been partners, and if you don't know anything about them, we're going to put their website up so you can maybe navigate as we're having a conversation with our guest today. And then also 40 by 80, that's the wholly owned subsidiary of the Pittsburgh Tech Council, where we're working on all things entrepreneurship and workforce development in this region. So we've muted your microphone so that we can hear our guest, and we put a chat session in, and that is for you to ask our guest questions, not to sell your wares. That's not what today is about. So I'm pretty thrilled that we have an opportunity to hear from Paul Mango. Again, this is the second time he's been with us, and he is with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and we are going to discuss the status of Operation Warp Speed. We've been staying pretty close to it, and Paul serves as the Deputy Chief of Staff for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and he is no stranger to Southwestern Pennsylvania. So before we just jump in and talk about the status, let's welcome, thank you. I know this is a critical moment in history. This is the second time, as I mentioned earlier, that you've been with us. The first time we spent much of our time discussing the timeline for a vaccine. At that time, the fastest that a vaccine had been brought to the market was about 5.5 years. Today, we have 2 vaccines approved, and I think some more in the pipeline. So let's just, before we jump into the status, just talk about the original mission so you can set the table for everyone here about Operation Warp Speed.
Sure, thanks for having me, and greetings to everyone in Western Pennsylvania. I know there's some snow back there, so hopefully you'll have a white Christmas. I think just to go back and talk about Operation Warp Speed from its inception, there was actually 3 major components to it. It was vaccines, it's therapeutics, and diagnostics. And there's really good news on all fronts. Obviously, you've read a lot about the Pfizer vaccine and now the Moderna vaccine. I'll come back to those in a second, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that there's 2 other vaccines that are imminent, meaning in the next month, we hope to get the type of authorization to ship them, and that's Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca. We're particularly excited about Johnson & Johnson because it's a single-dose vaccine, and that makes things a lot easier from a logistical standpoint. But just going back to Pfizer and Moderna, we're shipping out about 8 million doses this week. We shipped out about 3 million last week, so it's ramping up. The Moderna vaccine is terrific in the sense that it doesn't require ultra low cold storage, normal freezer. That makes it easier, and more important, the Pfizer vaccine is shipped in batches of 975, but the Moderna is shipped in batches of 100. So we can actually get it to places that may take a little bit longer, a physician's office or whatever that may not have 975 persons coming in 5 days. We can get it out there and use it in rural environments more effectively. So that's where a lot of it is going this week. There's about 4,000 different locations that will get vaccines this week. And thus far, FedEx and UPS have done a spectacular job. Even last week during the snowstorms that were all over the country, they didn't miss a beat. They didn't miss a delivery. I think 1 or 2 were a little bit late, but they didn't miss any. So they've had a perfect record so far. One little issue we're dealing with today is in our computer system, whenever a site is authorized by the state or the jurisdiction to receive vaccines, they have to put their operating hours in. And we're sending out about 1,200 orders today, and 50 of them were to sites that told us they weren't going to be open today. So they're not going to get their shipments because we can't waste those vaccines. Just a small, on one of our sides, a small communication issue. Either they were open and they didn't tell us, or they're not open and they ordered anyway and we're not shipping. But those are the types of day-to-day things we're dealing with. relatively minor
Mhm.
compared to the larger mission at hand, which is to get all Americans vaccinated. Go ahead.
No, it's only been 9 days,
Yeah, it's
right?
only been 9 days. So we'll get 20 million doses out before the end of the year. And then we're looking at 30 million additional first doses in January. Plus we start sending out the second doses. So there'll be 50 million doses going out total in January, because we're withholding some back right now because we want everyone to get his or her second dose. And then come February, it's about 80 million if all the production schedules are on track. And that's even without Johnson & Johnson and without AstraZeneca. So those could be real blowout months if we get those two going by February. And if all goes well, as we've said before, April, May, all Americans who want the vaccine and are eligible to get it, like kids under 16 aren't, will have an opportunity to get it. Just real quickly on therapeutics, we continue to be very excited about the monoclonal antibodies and increasing evidence that convalescent plasma, when used early, is very effective. So these are, as you know, both forms of antibodies that are injected into the bloodstream when one's body is just ramping up the defense system. So when used early, they're very, very effective. We've had a little bit of trouble in that we've shipped out a lot and some places aren't using it. We have hundreds of thousands of doses, but the complication is it's administered in an outpatient environment, and requires the appropriate IV type of team to do it. So most of our shipments have gone to hospitals, and some hospitals just aren't finding it convenient to use. I don't want to criticize them, but the point is, I think for everyone on the phone or on the Zoom, if you're a patient or if you know a patient, they should start asking, hey, is there any availability of these monoclonal antibodies? If their symptoms are still relatively light, they're not an inpatient. The emergency use authorization is just for outpatient administration. So after you're admitted, they actually can't use it. So anyway, we're very excited about those. And then I just want to say a word about lab testing, because we haven't talked too much about it. But last week, you probably heard the announcement about a technology called eLume, E-L-L-U-M-E. It's the first over-the-counter, completely home-administered COVID test. Francis Collins out at the NIH and his team in the early spring invested heavily in that technology. And again, we talk about vaccines coming to market quickly, but for an over-the-counter point of care tests, completely self-administered, above 90% sensitivity and specificity, to be done this quickly is just unbelievable. So we think this will really help the American people, self-diagnose a bit and make sure they feel comfortable if they're going out to a restaurant, if they're going out to a family gathering or whatever. Just give them a little bit more comfort that they're doing okay. And I think it's a relatively inexpensive test, similar to the Binex test, which is $5 or $6 a pop, which is better than the laboratory PCR tests, which are around 100. So it's a game changer in terms of time, convenience, and cost. And again, the NIH is very proud of its ushering this technology to market. So I think that's the general update. We want to leave a lot of time for questions.
Yes. We have a bunch of questions. Before we jump in, there was $69 billion that was allocated, right, for vaccine and therapeutic investments. Is there anything else that you want to talk about in there in terms of that allocation? Because I can feel it just by talking to you that we are moving at warp speed, and it is pretty exciting considering 2020. Yeah,
is that the new supplemental that was just discussed over the weekend? Are you saying?
Right.
A lot of that was for testing, so that the states can continue testing. I know some of it was for vaccine distribution. And I think when we say vaccine distribution, that is really going to be used for a lot of marketing and communications, because the states, the only thing they really have to do is tell us where they want things shipped, and everything is shipped there. The vaccines, the needles, the syringes, the swabs, the face masks, the dry ice even. We're even shipping out dry ice, and we'll ship to any corner of Fifth and Vine in the country. Just tell us where to get it. So I think they're going to be using a lot of those funds for maybe some advertising and to address vaccine hesitancy and those types of things. Although the latest reports I'm seeing is that we're up over 60% of Americans from down in the 40s a couple of weeks ago in terms of their eagerness to get the vaccine.
All right, that's great. Let's use this time to start to answer some of the questions that have been posed. So Jonathan, you want to start at the top?
Right at the top. So want to know if companies want to assist with warp speed, what's the best way for them to communicate their capabilities with HHS or others?
Gosh, well, it depends on what those capabilities are. But right now, I think the most important thing they can do is again, is what we just talked about, is help us deal with whatever vaccine hesitancy. Obviously, the other thing that we're exploring every day, it depends on what type of company it is, but for the vaccines that are proven to be very effective, we are desperately looking for additional manufacturing capacity. Why wait? And it depends on which vaccine it is. Some have their bottleneck at the bulk production, some at fill finishing. That's highly specific assets that are able to do that. So we've pretty much scrounged around the whole country, and we're trying to get some pharmaceutical companies to work with others to give up some of their own capacity. But if any of that's lying around, we certainly would be happy to use that. A little bit aside from warp speed, but the only other thing we're really feel that we're a little bit exposed on is nitrile gloves. So if anyone, again, that's not easy to stand up.
Right.
The factories that do that have equipment that's about as long as a football field, so it's not like you can do it in your basement.
Right.
But that if you said what are the things that we're struggling with a little bit, I would say we'd love to have more gloves that are FDA approved.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So Tracy Lawless in the private chat sent me one here. Really good question. She wants to know, is there a plan once vaccines are available in greater quantity to have a tiered vaccination program so people don't have to congregate in line and wait for a vaccine?
Yeah, so Tracy and I go to the same hairdresser, but for some reason her hair looks a lot better than mine does. I don't know if she's out there listening. I see her up in Wexford every now and then.
That's
But
funny.
well, let me tell you what, CVS and Walgreens, and there's actually 19 chain pharmacies. I think Giant Eagle is in that group in Western Pennsylvania. And those stores are all going to be turned on for vaccines in the next few weeks. And the way they're doing it and the way we've been working with them is by appointment only. So let's just call it every 15 minutes. So what you'll be able to do is make your appointment and make sure you're not in line with a bunch of other folks. I think as important, I know CVS is doing this, I'm not 100% sure Giant Eagle is, when you make your appointment, they also force you to make your second appointment, so that there's a much higher probability you'll come back for your second dose. We are a little bit worried about this. So Shingrix, for instance, the shingles vaccine, there's about 80% of Americans who get the first dose and get the second dose, but 20% don't get the second dose. We don't want that to happen with COVID. So I think from a behavioral scientist standpoint, making the second appointment when you make the first one, it's harder to opt out than to opt in. So I think that's a good policy. Hopefully Giant Eagle will be doing the same thing. But we're very conscious of this. And we saw this with the laboratory testing in the spring, and there were long lines, and we want to avoid, not only for contagious purposes, but we want to avoid lines because that's not the right thing to ask Americans to do.
For sure. So Matthew Leidick wants to know, he mentions the president mentioned use of the military in planning and or executing Operation Warp Speed. Can you speak to how our domestic forces have served or will serve in that regard and the impact in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, so you won't see, unless the governor calls out the National Guard, you won't see the U.S. military administering any vaccines. I think I said this when we talked last, but it's highly unlikely that any federal employee will touch a dose of vaccine before it goes into Americans' arms. We are relying very, very heavily on the private sector to do this. So it's McKesson as a distributor. It is, as I said, UPS and FedEx as the shippers, if you will. It's our chain pharmacies and our hospitals, and then eventually physician offices as the vaccinators themselves. So You won't see any federal military forces out there. Again, each jurisdiction, if it wants to call out their National Guard, they can do it. We don't think that's necessary, but that's a decision of the governor. What the military has done is an extraordinary job in all of the planning, in the establishment of all the partnerships and the contracting. The Department of Defense has a huge contracting capability that we just didn't have at HHS. And you know, we've probably spent close to $30 billion on, you know, many hundreds of different vendors, needles, syringes, vials, as we've said, raw materials, equipment. They've also, using the Defense Production Act, have acquired those things from all over the world and flown them in and cut, you know, months off of normal shipment times, that type of thing. So they are our primary point of interaction with all of our partners. They are in partnership with the Centers for Disease Control and collectively dealing with all the jurisdictions. There's 64 jurisdictions, and right down to exactly how many doses every day and how we keep track of that from an IT perspective. We have a highly sophisticated IT system that can tell us where every dose is from factory to receipt. Just, you know, FedEx and UPS have lent us their systems. We can track everything, and then we have our own systems that once it gets there, we can track whether it's been used or not. So the military is running all that. There's a vaccine operations center here in the building on the second floor. There's probably 25 or 30 military personnel down there, and they are 24/7 watching everything and making sure we intervene when there's any type of issue. So 3 cheers for the Department of Defense, and particularly the Army Logistics Command. I have to put in just a little plug for the Army team, the Army football team. They now beat Navy and Air Force 2 consecutive weeks in a row. So it's a good year all around for the Army.
Yeah, it is. Jonathan, keep going. There's
Excellent.
a bunch of questions.
They keep coming here. It's just so good to see this conversation going on. So from Wendy Parkin, she says, I read Pfizer's clinical trial, and it states the vaccine is 95% effective as measured over 7 days. How long is the efficacy expected to last with this?
Yeah, no one knows that yet. We just, those studies are going on, and obviously only time can resolve that. We hope it's years, you know, like a tetanus shot. We hope it's 7 years or so. We just don't know. We just don't know. So it'll be a while before we, like I said, only time can resolve that.
Time will tell. Absolutely.
You know, it's at least a few months, because there's been tens of thousands of folks who were vaccinated starting in August, and none of them has, well, I shouldn't say none. The efficacy was 95%. 5% of the vaccinated group, actually, of those who acquired the virus, 5% were in the vaccinated group and 95% were in the placebo group. So for whatever reason,
Yeah.
A few folks have gotten it. It was 11 out of 196 got it in the vaccinated group for Moderna, for instance. But we don't know the persistence, and hopefully we don't have to do this every year.
Absolutely. So Scott Barniak from SDLC wants to know, are there other therapeutics in the pipeline that could be approved and released sometime soon? Yeah,
so the 3 or 4 or 5 big ones, obviously remdesivir is a very big one, and that is an antiviral. It's not an antibody, it's an antiviral. And then we have the 3 antibodies, which is convalescent plasma, and the monoclonals from Regeneron and from Lilly. There are a couple of others, and then there's the corticosteroids, which have been proven to be very effective late stage as a therapy in the hospital. Those aren't new, they've been around and they're plentiful. There's a couple of others. In fact, we're likely, I can't really talk about it, we're likely to make an announcement this week on one that is extremely exciting, and it's inpatient based. So it's after you are in a pretty severe condition, it seems to dramatically reduce mortality. So that, stand by for that one probably later this week. There are about 400 other clinical trials underway for different therapeutics. So we'll have to see, and we'll continue to make investments as necessary. And then, you know, the requirement there is that they do prove to be effective in the early stage trials. But I think just one note to our care providers around the country, they've done, regardless of the therapeutics, they've evolved so effectively in terms of how to care for these patients, when to use a ventilator, testing folks earlier, diagnosing earlier, that the case fatality rate has dropped by 85% since March and April. So I think it's, again, you know, 3 cheers for the Army, but also our frontline care providers are incredibly adaptive, and the odds of surviving this are so much greater than they were in the early spring.
Yeah, it seems like that. Jonathan?
Keep on going. I don't think we have enough time to get through all these questions today. It's amazing how many we have. So is there reporting on vaccine supply and demand, quantities vaccinated, and who's next in the phased approach?
I'm sorry, so the question is what, Jonathan? Say that again.
Yeah, see, is there reporting on vaccine supply and demand? Wants to know if the quantity.
Yeah, so our best guess is right now we'll be supply constrained into February, meaning there'll be more demand than supply. Supply will roughly be the equivalent of demand in March and April, and by May, we think supply will far exceed demand. And, you know, we'll be in a position to help some other countries out with exports and that type of thing. So we do have options to procure a couple billion doses of vaccine should we need them. And one of the questions is the one that one of the listeners posed a little while ago, which is, if this thing isn't persistent more than 6 or 9 months, we need to begin thinking about next season already. So we don't want to give up all of our options if we're going to need them ourselves. But that's the general scenario, and it all depends on, you know, uptake and how many folks are interested. But if you think about it, there's 70 or 80 million Americans under age 16. They're not eligible for this vaccine yet. So you take that away and we're down to, you know, 260 million maybe. If we're really, really lucky, 80% will choose to get the vaccine. In fact, I think most of the scientists have said 70% will confer immunity on our population. So you could, you know, think about that as, you know, roughly, I don't know, 170 or 180 million persons vaccinated. That would be, you know, we'll hit that in the spring for sure. So we're pretty optimistic. It should be a great summer to going back to the shore and back in restaurants and hopefully even traveling overseas if that's what you want to do.
That's what we want to hear.
So there are a couple of more questions, Jonathan, I just want to hit before I.
Surely. Yeah. So here's a really good technical question from Sam Brower. So hang with us here, Paul. He says, I don't understand why the mRNA products are considered vaccines since they don't have adjuvants and they use a delivery system that's similar to other biologic drugs. Wouldn't it be more accurate to call these products prophylactic drugs instead of vaccines? Also, what's the residence time of these products in the body?
Gosh, that may be a great question for one of our physicians here to answer.
That's fair enough.
I'm qualified to answer it, but I do know that one of the things, two things actually. One is we're thinking about using, and there's studies going on, the monoclonal antibodies prophylactically. So the antibodies could almost in some ways be considered temporary vaccines. And what we're also studying for the mRNA is whether, and we don't know the answer to this yet, what we know for sure is that it precludes you from getting very sick. What we don't know about this vaccine, or whatever Sam would like to call it, I'm just not familiar with all those scientific terms. What we don't know is whether you can still transmit it. Even though you're not getting sick, it could be in your nasal passage. You might be able to actually transmit it. Again, those studies are going on, and we hope to learn more from that. But if Sam wants to send me via email his questions,
Great.
What I can do is I'll send it up to Tony Fauci or someone and ask them to answer it.
That's pretty cool.
Great. That's great. So thank you. Jonathan, did we ask about the new strains in Europe or in the UK?
No, I think we got to bring that up. That's really important.
About that? Paul, do you know anything about, you know, what's happening?
We've had meetings all weekend about that. And again, I don't want to put myself as the scientist, but I'll tell you what I've heard from our scientists, including Dr. Collins at the NIH, who's looking at this very closely. And that is, they believe this variant has been around for a long time, not just, you know, like the last couple of weeks, probably October it's been around. It's not 100% clear whether it is more transmissible. What happened in the UK is they identified it recently and associated that with a recent spike. And they said, oh, it must be more transmissible. But what our physicians are saying is maybe not. They know for sure it's not more lethal. So even if it is more transmissible, it's not more lethal. They feel that regardless, there's actually several hundred variants out there for COVID-19 already. They believe that the vaccines will be robust across all of those variants that are identified thus far. So they feel very confident up to this point that there won't be, this variant won't be able to evade the vaccine. And the only small consideration is some of the monoclonal antibodies are aimed at a single spike protein, almost by definition, monoclonal antibody. And they're not 100% sure whether the variants might cause that to be less effective, those to be less effective. So that's kind of where we are. I think it's, again, I've just listened to these conversations. I'm not the subject matter expert, but I would say the initial reports coming out of the UK a little bit hyperbolic.
So one of the things I think it's Ron Rosenfeld is asking, what's the latest estimate of the current IFR? Do you know what IFR is?
Yeah, sure. I know what an IFR is. Depends on which one he's talking about. There is certainly one that CMS is contemplating, but can you say a little bit more?
He's calling the infection fatality rate.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
The IFR is another.
Yeah, there's another, an aviation.
We have a term called interim final rule.
Right. There's also an aviation term. That's
The
what I
incident, the incident infection rates. Yeah, I have all the infection. I have all the infection rates from this morning here. Hold on a second.
Right, as opposed to the
I
case
can tell you
fatality.
in a minute here.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Burke sends them to us every morning. They are extraordinarily low. Anything over there, Justine? I'm giving you I'll give you roughly the last.
Sure, that's great.
The last full months. If you're over 70, they're in the 6 to 7% range. Okay. If you're kind of 49 to 70, they go down into the two point something. If you're in the, I'm just giving you rough numbers, 30 to 49, they're maybe 0.08. And then they go way down. If you're, in your 20s or under 18, it's like 0.01. Now remember, for over 70, we started at, again, in April, it was 29%.
Wow.
Part of that was we weren't doing as much testing and so forth, but case fatality rates have dropped, as I said, in every age group, every age cohort, and in total by about 85%. Very similar across age groups, how much they've dropped.
So what about the focus on, fighting disinformation and getting the information out? What about that? I mean, that's something that I feel that we have to have just such a monocular focus on in terms of communication. And I know the leadership of your organization is certainly, preoccupied with that.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're at the Secretary's orders, we're being as transparent as we can. They're holding, in fact, I just came up from a news conference. They hold them 3 times a week, General Perna, Secretary Azar, Monsef Slawi. If you're watching the airwaves, they're on TV all weekend on the Sunday shows trying to convey information. We've seen, I hate to put it this way, but since November 3rd, we've seen a little bit of a shift in the media toward celebrating Operation Warp Speed, and therefore much more receptive to the information, and conveying the information that's coming out. So that's working in our favor a bit more now. There's tons of stuff being published on CDC website, MMWRs every day. I think it's actually a little bit of information overload, if anything, we might be suffering from. And so, we work very hard to try to limit our messaging going out so the American people can digest it. And right now it is, I think our major message is help is on the way. Please be patient over the holidays. Don't do something rash because we want you here next year at this time. And if we can just get through the next couple of months, there are really, really bright days ahead.
It seems like it. It really does seem like it. I mean, the amount of progress that has been made, the dissemination, and obviously the term warp speed really has
Yeah.
occurred. I'm very excited about the next few
Yeah.
months. And do you think that we'll all have to show evidence of having the vaccine? Do you think we'll go towards that kind of model, not just with the airlines and travel, but do you think we'll go to that model?
Yeah, there's I don't know the answer, but I can tell you there's a lot of reluctance here to do that. It sounds a little bit like 1984. Sounds a little bit like government invasiveness, and that's not the philosophy of the folks here today. I'm not saying that might not change at some point.
Right.
We can tell you we're very reluctant to do something like that. I mean, the public health folks understand it from a public health perspective, and they think it could be positive. And I'm not criticizing them, but it's not their job to think about the broader implications of that. And we're thinking about the broader implications. And
yeah, I mean, I just imagine when it comes to air travel, and you've seen what just happened over the weekend with the UK
yeah,
and airlines across the EU.
yeah.
Look at shutting down.
Just a plug for the airlines, they've done a spectacular job, and all the evidence we have, including the CDC, is that when you're in that aluminum tube, it's actually a very safe place to be. The problem is what people do when they get to their destination.
Get out.
But actually the airlines, and I've flown a couple times myself, the secretary has flown several times. He makes a point of saying he flies Southwest. The point is that we found it to be statistically extremely safe. So people shouldn't worry about flying. They should just not let their guard down in the airport, by the way, which is a less safe place, and at the destination if they're celebrating holidays with their families.
Right. It's yeah. So there's a whole bunch of comments that are still here. If you have other questions, send them to bkennedy@pghtech.org, and we will get them to Paul and his team. Paul, you have taken more time than we've asked of you, and I just can't thank you enough for your leadership, for representing us, and just getting through what is an historical time.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks for having me. I won't be in Western PA for the holidays, so I want to extend my best wishes to all my friends and colleagues back there. I hope you have a great, safe holiday, and hopefully a little bit of snow will still be on the ground on December 25th.
Yeah. All right. Well, stay safe. Thanks, everyone. Okay. I think we do have a business as usual tomorrow, right, Jonathan?
Absolutely. We have Earn stopping by, which is Jessica Brooks and Zig Martin, to talk about how they're helping folks find jobs that are having a hard time finding jobs. So it should be a great session.
Oh, okay, great. Okay, well, thanks everyone. Really appreciate Paul joining us today. Couldn't be more timely. And we'll see you tomorrow. If we don't see you tomorrow, have a great holiday. Thanks.
Yes.